You hear your mother's voice calling you home for dinner. The smell of fresh bread drifts through the narrow streets of your village. You're 7 years old, and the world feels small, safe, knowable. Then you see them, men in crimson robes, their faces carved from stone, moving through the village like shadows swallowing light. Your mother's scream cuts through the air. Strong hands close around your arms, and in that moment, everything you know, your name, your language, the sound of church bells, begins to die. Before we step further into this darkness, I need to know, where are you watching this from? It's staggering to me that a story this buried, this uncomfortable, can reach every corner of our world today. That's the power of seeking truth together. This was the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century. Not the empire of magnificent mosques and silk roads that fills our history books. This is the empire that kept ledgers, spreadsheets of stolen children, price lists for human flesh, administrative records so detailed, so coldly bureaucratic that modern historians can barely stomach reading them. What you're about to hear comes from their own documents, filed away in archives across Turkey, written in the careful script of officials who saw nothing wrong with what they were recording. The practice had a name that sounds almost administrative: Dev Shirme, the child levy. But the Christian families of the Balkans had a different name for it. They called it the blood tax, because what the Ottoman state collected wasn't gold or grain. It was sons. Every 3 to 5 years, officials would arrive in villages throughout Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania. They carried detailed census records showing exactly how many Christian families lived in each village, how many boys of the right age when that village had last contributed to the levy. This wasn't random violence, it was systematic harvest. The selection process happened in the village square. Boys between 7 and 20 were lined up. Officials examined them like buyers at a livestock market, checking teeth, measuring height, assessing intelligence through quick questions. They were looking for specific qualities: physical beauty, mental sharpness, the kind of boy who could be molded, broken, rebuilt into something useful to the empire. But here's what makes this practice cut deeper than simple cruelty. These children weren't being taken to die in mines or fields. They were being taken to serve in the most intimate spaces of imperial power. The most attractive boys would be sent to Topkapi Palace in Constantinople. There, they would enter the Sultan's private quarters. There, they would learn what it meant to be valuable for your vulnerability. The journey to Constantinople took weeks. Children who had never left their villages were marched across mountains and rivers, sleeping in open fields, eating whatever scraps their captors provided. Many died from disease or exhaustion. Their small bodies were left in unmarked graves, far from the mothers who would spend the rest of their lives wondering if today might be the day their son found his way home. The survivors faced something worse than death: systematic psychological annihilation. The moment they arrived at the palace, their birth names were taken. They were given Turkish names that bore no resemblance to what their mothers had called them. They were forbidden to speak their native languages. Any word of Serbian, Greek, Bulgarian, even whispered in sleep, earned brutal beatings. They were forced to convert to Islam through ceremonies designed to humiliate their former faith. Some were made to spit on crosses. Others burned Christian texts while palace officials watched, taking notes on who resisted, who wept, who seemed too attached to their past. Within months, most couldn't remember their original names. The empire had discovered something terrifying. If you take a child young enough, you can erase entire identities. You can make them forget they were ever someone else. But the Devshirme system had layers of horror that went deeper still. The boys deemed most physically beautiful, the ones officials marked with special notation in their ledgers, were set aside for a different fate entirely. These children would never join the Janissary military corps. They would never see a battlefield. They were destined for the palace's inner sanctums, where they would serve the Sultan and his courtiers in ways that defy comfortable discussion. Some of these boys were castrated. Not in Constantinople. Islamic law technically forbade the practice within the empire's heartland, so the boys were sent to Egypt or Ethiopia, where Christian or Jewish doctors performed the operations, allowing Ottoman officials to maintain plausible deniability while still acquiring the eunuchs they desired. The mortality rate from castration was staggering. Historical records suggest that only 1 in 10 boys survived the procedure. Pause on that number. To acquire 100 eunuchs, the empire was willing to mutilate 1,000 children. 900 would die in agony, from blood loss, infection, shock, so that 100 could survive to serve. The survivors faced a reality that many considered worse than the death that claimed their brothers. African boys typically had their entire genitalia removed, becoming what the Ottomans called black eunuchs. These eunuchs were considered more trustworthy around the Sultan's harem and often rose to positions of genuine power within the palace hierarchy. Their loyalty was assured by their complete severance from the normal world of men. European boys from the Balkans usually had only their testicles removed, becoming white eunuchs who served in administrative roles. But the distinction mattered little to the children experiencing it. Both forms of castration destroyed any possibility of normal human intimacy. These boys would never marry, never father children, never experience sexual connection as nature intended. They existed solely to serve an empire that had stolen everything from them: their homes, their names, their bodies, their futures. But castration wasn't the only fate awaiting beautiful boys in the Ottoman system. Some were designated as Koçak dancers, young male performers who dressed as women and entertained at parties and celebrations. These boys occupied a disturbing space between genders, neither fully male nor female in Ottoman eyes. They wore elaborate makeup and women's clothing, learned seductive dances, and performed for audiences of drunk and aggressive men. Contemporary accounts describe the violence that surrounded these performances. Men would become so aroused by the young dancers that they would fight each other, sometimes to the death, for the opportunity to assault them. Glasses shattered. Knives came out. Blood spilled on the same floors where moments before terrified children had danced. The dancers themselves had no protection from this violence. They were expected to submit to whatever advances came their way. Their bodies were treated as public property for crowds that saw them not as children, but as entertainment. The practice became so associated with sexual violence that authorities eventually suppressed public Koçak performances in the 19th century. But by then, generations of boys had already been subjected to this systematic abuse. Then there was a practice so disturbing that even the empire tried to keep it secret: the Tav-Shanolan system. The term translates roughly to bunny boys, a sickening euphemism that barely conceals the horror it describes. These were young Christian boys brought to the palace specifically for the sexual gratification of high-ranking officials. Unlike other forms of palace service, the Tav-Shanolan system operated in complete secrecy. These boys had no official status. No records documented their presence. No laws protected them. They existed in the shadows of imperial power, hidden away from public view and the historical record, available for whatever their masters desired. The system was deliberately kept small and secretive. But its existence reveals something crucial about Ottoman sexual practices. This wasn't about cultural differences or different moral standards. This was about the systematic sexual exploitation of children, organized and maintained by the highest levels of government. The psychological devastation extended beyond the immediate victims. Families lived in constant terror of the child levy. Parents would sometimes mutilate their own children, scarring faces, breaking fingers, inducing lameness, to make them less desirable to Ottoman collectors. The empire had created a society where loving parents felt compelled to harm their own sons to protect them from worse fates. And here's the darkest twist of all. Boys who survived the initial trauma often became the ones selecting the next generation of victims. Young men who had been taken from Balkan villages would return years later as Ottoman officials, their faces hardened and their eyes empty, pointing out the most attractive children in villages just like the ones they had once called home. The empire had perfected a self-perpetuating cycle of trauma that ensured its own continuation. But the Devshirme system was only one dimension of Ottoman sexual exploitation. The empire's treatment of women and girls operated on an even larger scale, creating a marketplace of human flesh that dwarfed anything seen in the contemporary world. The slave markets of Constantinople functioned with the efficiency of modern corporations. Women were categorized, priced, and sold according to a complex hierarchy that reduced human beings to merchandise. African women commanded different prices than European women. Virgins were worth more than non-virgins. Young girls brought higher prices than mature women. The empire maintained detailed pricing structures for human sexuality, all carefully recorded in commercial ledgers that survive to this day. A typical African girl intended for household work might sell for 1,500 to 2,500 kurush, but if she was destined for sexual use, the price could double or triple. European women, particularly those from Greece or the Balkans, commanded even higher prices, with some selling for amounts equivalent to small fortunes. The most expensive category was reserved for what the Ottomans called odaluk, women specifically trained for sexual service in imperial harems. These women could sell for tens of thousands of kurush, their value determined by beauty, training, and perceived fertility. The empire maintained training facilities where captured women were taught the arts of seduction, massage, and sexual performance. Traumatized captives were transformed into polished commodities through systematic instruction in how to please their future masters. These facilities operated like finishing schools, except the curriculum focused entirely on sexual techniques and the art of submissive behavior. The scale of this trade was staggering. Constantinople alone housed hundreds of thousands of enslaved women at any given time. The empire's expansion into Africa, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe was driven partly by insatiable demand for fresh supplies. Military campaigns were planned not just for territorial gain, but for human acquisition, with commanders calculating how many women they could expect to capture from each conquest. Behind each transaction was a human being torn from her family, stripped of her identity, and reduced to a sexual object for the pleasure of her purchaser. The empire's legal system provided these women with no protection whatsoever. A man could use his female slaves sexually without any legal consequences. If a slave woman became pregnant, her children belonged entirely to her master, who could sell them, kill them, or use them as he saw fit. The treatment of these women within the harems destroys any romantic mythology about palace life. Most harem women lived in conditions of constant fear, competing desperately for the attention that might elevate them from mere slaves to favored concubines. The competition was deliberately fostered by the system's design. Women were pitted against each other in elaborate displays designed to entertain their masters. Those who failed to please faced punishments ranging from beatings to starvation to outright execution. The psychological warfare within these spaces was as systematic as any military campaign. Women were encouraged to inform on each other, to sabotage rivals, to form temporary alliances that could be broken at any moment. The empire had created environments where natural bonds between women were corrupted into weapons of mutual destruction. Perhaps most disturbing was the fate of children born within this system. The empire's records show patterns that suggest infanticide was commonplace, particularly for children born to African mothers. Mixed-race children of these unions often disappeared from records immediately after birth, their existence seen as inconvenient complications in the machinery of sexual exploitation. Contemporary observers noted the suspicious absence of mixed-race children in Constantinople, despite the obvious presence of thousands of African women living in sexual relationships with Turkish men. The conclusion was inescapable. These children were being systematically eliminated to maintain the racial hierarchies the empire considered essential to its social order. Women who survived long enough to age out of sexual desirability faced fates often worse than death. They might be sold to brothels, abandoned on the streets, or simply killed to make room for younger replacements. The empire had no pension system for used-up concubines, no retirement plan for women who had spent their youth serving imperial pleasure. The legal framework reveals how deeply embedded sexual exploitation was in Ottoman governance. Laws explicitly stated that raping a free woman carried the death penalty, while raping a slave woman resulted in a fine equivalent to damaging someone's property. The empire had created a two-tiered system of human worth that made systematic sexual violence not just legal, but economically rational. The documentation of these practices exists in disturbing detail because the Ottomans were meticulous record keepers. They maintained ledgers tracking the ages, origins, and prices of enslaved people. They kept inventories of palace harems, listing women like furniture or livestock. They preserved correspondence between officials discussing the sexual preferences of their superiors and how to satisfy them through strategic procurement. These records survive today in archives across Turkey, undeniable evidence of systematic sexual exploitation that operated for centuries. The empire's own bureaucrats documented everything with the same attention to detail they brought to tax collection or military planning. They saw nothing shameful in their actions because they lived in a society that had completely normalized the sexual exploitation of vulnerable populations. These weren't isolated practices or cultural quirks. They were pillars of imperial finance. The slave trade generated revenues that funded military expansion, palace construction, and administrative operations. Trade routes were established specifically to facilitate human trafficking. Diplomatic agreements included clauses governing the exchange of slaves. The empire's budget depended on the systematic destruction of human dignity across 3 continents. Military strategies incorporated calculations about how many people could be captured and sold. The empire had created an entire infrastructure dedicated to the commodification of human sexuality. This wasn't peripheral to Ottoman power. It was central to how the empire functioned for over 6 centuries. The international response to these practices reveals how thoroughly the Ottoman system corrupted diplomatic relations. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed reports about the sexual horrors they witnessed, but often framed them as cultural differences rather than human rights violations. European powers that might have intervened were too busy profiting from Ottoman trade routes to risk diplomatic incidents over the fate of enslaved children and women. The empire's influence spread these practices far beyond its borders. Ottoman sexual customs were adopted by client states and trading partners who saw them as sophisticated approaches to population management. The systematic exploitation of sexuality became a model that other powers emulated, spreading the empire's particular brand of sexual violence across the known world. The consequences rippled across generations. Children who survived sexual trauma grew up unable to form healthy bonds. Women who escaped slavery carried psychological wounds that never healed. Men who participated in these systems lost the capacity for genuine intimacy or compassion. The empire had created entire populations whose relationship to sexuality was defined by violence, exploitation, and terror. Entire communities were hollowed out by the child levy. Villages in the Balkans lost their most promising young men generation after generation. The demographic impact was severe. Some regions never fully recovered from centuries of having their children systematically removed. The genetic and cultural legacy of this practice can still be traced in population studies across southeastern Europe. As the Ottoman Empire finally began to decline in the 19th and 20th centuries, these practices didn't simply disappear. They evolved and adapted. The infrastructure of sexual exploitation that had operated for centuries left cultural scars that persisted long after the empire's collapse. The last Ottoman Sultan was deposed in 1922, within living memory of people alive today. This history is closer than we think. The most horrifying aspect wasn't the brutality itself, though that was extreme. It was the systematic nature, the normalization, the integration into every aspect of imperial governance. The empire had created a machine for sexual exploitation of human beings, and that machine operated with bureaucratic efficiency for hundreds of years. Understanding these practices is not about condemning modern Turkey or Islam. It's about recognizing how power structures can corrupt human sexuality and turn intimate relationships into weapons of control. It's about remembering the millions of victims whose suffering has been largely forgotten by history. And it's about ensuring we remain vigilant against the conditions that allow such systematic exploitation to flourish. The Ottoman Empire lasted over 6 centuries and controlled the lives of millions. Its approach to human sexuality shaped the experiences of countless generations and left scars that persist to this day. The empire's sexual practices represent one of history's most systematic examples of how power can corrupt every aspect of human experience. These were deliberate policies designed to reduce human beings to objects for the gratification of those in power. The empire created an entire civilization built on the systematic destruction of human dignity, and the consequences of that destruction echoed across centuries. In a 16th century Istanbul ledger, a list records Serbian boys taken in 1543. Palace service. Castration approved. Janissary corps. Beside one name, Petar, age 8, it reads, cried for mother, resisted conversion, requires discipline. That note is all that remains of him. No grave, no memory, only ink that never faded. History waits in archives, reminding us how power without conscience destroys, and asking, how do we prevent it from happening again?